After the 4-year gap between Genesis and Destiny, another 5 was to pass before the Daleks would return again, minus a short scene and was basically a glorified cameo in the Five Doctors. This gap is only about 3 months or so shorter than the gap between their supposed final end in Evil and the return in Day, and one that, discarding the gap between Classic and New Who for obvious reasons, has not been surpassed between Dalek stories since, although over the 3 years since the Evil of the Daleks it looks like we finally might be doing so now. This, I think, speaks to attitudes towards the Daleks over time, and their pretty obvious overuse in New Who. The Daleks between the end of the Letts era and this point, nearly halfway through the 80s, was just seen as another villain, to be brought back when the time was right, but not used as a crutch, as was pretty undeniably the case throughout the 60s and much of New Who. I think the reason for this was that Doctor Who had finally found its identity free of the Pepper Potts with the success of the Pertwee era, and the further success of the Hinchcliffe era, sort of the cast the shackles away a bit, showing that the show was much more than the Daleks. This obviously undersells its success in much of the 60s, but it was in the shadow of the Daleks that was cast over it that was finally able to be escaped during the early and mid-70s. And when Graham Williams and later John Nathan Turner took over, this foundation allowed them to build up the show on their own merits. It was not as creatively successful, and certainly was up and down in terms of popular success when compared to the Hinchcliffe era, but it didn't need to rely on the Daleks to be successful. The single Dalek story of this period being consistently overshadowed by the story that follows, having the highest ratings of all time, being consistently ranked among the show's best, shows that. Fast forward to New Who, and the revival being an unexpected roaring success, somewhat difficult to uncouple from the success of its revival of the Daleks themselves. Kids across every playground were shouting exterminate, and believe me, I was there, and the new gold Daleks adorned basically every bit of merchandise it was possible to adorn. Their appearances were so frequent that it gave birth to the long-standing rumour that the Terry Nation estate had it, so that the Daleks had to return in every series as a condition for their return, something that was only conclusively put to bed with their total absence from Series 14. We'll get to all of this when we get to the New Who Dalek stories, but the point is, the Daleks were seen as much more of a crutch in those days than they were in the 80s. And I think using the Daleks sparingly is a good thing, definitely. One of the few good things about RTD2 has been the total absence of the Daleks, as their overuse can just diminish their threat and menace, and make them seem like run-of-the-mill when they should feel anything but. This means that when they do return it can be given the appropriate gravitas. They feel like a real event, the Doctor going up against his most powerful enemies as they are, well, resurrected. The problem is you don't have to actually meet that with the story, and this is where my theory falls down, considering this is 2 fairly underwhelming stories in a row where the Daleks returned after long absences. Yeah, this story is not great. It's not bad, it's better than Destiny to be sure, it feels like a more coherent and better thought out piece than that story did, but ultimately a bit of a disappointment, and I have to say weaker on this rewatch than I'd thought previously. Resurrection of the Daleks is unique in a few ways, its most infamous being its shockingly high body count, which TARDIS Wiki dutifully informs me is 76. It's oft repeated this story has a higher body count than The Terminator, but I was actually quite shocked to learn in researching this that it's almost double. That film's body count is only 39. Now, this isn't necessarily a problem with the story itself, in fact it's a major driver behind one of the story's best elements, but it needed careful handling to avoid seeming gratuitous, and I'm not going to say it entirely failed at this, but it wasn't entirely successful either, and there are points where it just seems like we're seeing deaths for the sake of it. Because this is Doctor Who, it's not as if the deaths are so violent to be shocking, so it just feels more annoying than anything else, and that's not a great feeling to be achieving. This story was written by then script editor Eric Saward, and he has mentioned many times over the years he was not happy with how this one turned out, which is both an impressive level of self-reflection from a Doctor Who writer, and also entirely understandable given I'd say the story has 2 major problems. The first is a lack of focus. It feels flabby and overstuffed, like there's too much going on, which doesn't allow proper focus on any of it. It's a story that would have maybe fit better as a 6-parter to allow all the plots time to breathe, but they weren't doing those anymore, so it's stuck into 4, or at least intended to, more in a moment. And there's just so much going on. There's a story of the space station, of its crew resisting after the Daleks invade, the Daleks defeating the Mavellan War and their status now, Davros and his plans and designs, his relationship with the Daleks, Lytton, and his entourage, the stuff in the warehouse, the duplicates, Stein's story, the Dalek plot to destroy Gallifrey, character work with the Doctor and Tegan. There's just so much to pack in, and not much of it gets the due it probably deserved. All of the ideas are fine, great even, but without enough space they stay as ideas, not as actual stories, which is very much a problem. In a way it's a prototype for the problems New Who would so often suffer. The second major problem is a feeling to me, at least, of a lack of depth. This is related to a problem 1, in that none of the story beats can really get any, but I think it's more than that. The story just doesn't seem to have a point. Hell, even Destiny had this. It wanted to explore ideas like logic, etc., but this story just doesn't seem to be about something. What's the idea behind it? Best I can tell it's about shooting each other in dark corridors, which is not a great fundamental basis for a story. I'm just not really sure what it's about, and this is a major weakness in the story where there's already a lot that feels gratuitous. A final note about the story is it was originally intended to be 4 25-minute episodes, as almost every story at this time was. However, coverage of the 1984 Winter Olympics reduced the amount of available broadcast slots. Bear in mind Doctor Who was on midweek at this point and did not have a cosy Saturday tea time slot, which meant it was more vulnerable to stuff like this than it otherwise would have been. The solution therefore was to edit it into 2 double-length episodes to fit the available slots. This does make more of a difference than you might imagine. The original cliffhangers to part 1 and 3 of a Dalek yelling and Davros yelling respectively seem extremely odd and out of place when not followed by the sting and theme music, and it's very much because they're being seen in a way that was not the intention. Also, the pacing does suffer a bit even with such a minor change, as it means there's 45 minutes of dark corridors and shooting people without a break instead of 25, which doesn't help the feelings I get from the story that I mentioned before. I think it's debatable which is the true version of the story. The 4-parter was how it was originally intended to be viewed, but the 2-parter was how it was broadcast. I honestly couldn't say which I'd say is the true version. I've always watched the 4-parter as that was the only option on the original DVD, so this time I plumped for the 2-parter on the later release special edition, just to change things up, and I did find it made the differences I said just now. If I had to choose between the two, I'd probably go with the 4-part version, just because it feels a tiny bit better paced. But in the end, I guess it's up to you which you think is the proper version. So, on to the actual story, and first with the production. This story was directed by Matthew Robinson, a director that frankly reminds me of some of the Who Megalol New Who directors who pop in my reviews all the time, who directed like 1 or 2 stories. He directed 2 stories. This was his first, and his second was the next season's opener, Attack of the Cybermen. Less said about the better, but in terms of this story, his work is mixed. On the one hand, a lot of the staging is quite poor. One only needs to look at the opening TARDIS scenes where the turbulence is so awful they have to cling onto the console, except at those points where they can just stand up more or less normally. Remember, they need to be shaking around, then grab onto the console again. In fact, directing his actors seems to be Robinson's big weakness here. Staging issues like that said are one thing, but allowing Rodney Boo's delivery of "I can't stand the confusion in my mind" or the acting of the soldiers being exterminated near the end to get into the final cut is honestly kind of embarrassing. Oh, and the crew member guarding Davros shooting one of Lytton's troops, then putting her gun down and not really bothering to defend herself anymore before she gets shot. It's just bizarre in its staging. That's a problem throughout, and that can feel almost sloppy at times, and doesn't help the feeling of the rather flat feeling the story can have. People who haven't been imbued with much passion by the director boringly exposit, and, well, the results are predictable. Another area I think he gets wrong is shooting the Daleks themselves. His approach feels too pedestrian, too much like he's just filming them as he would any other element in the story, and that isn't the right approach at all. I probably said it before at some point during these Dalek reviews, but the best way to film the Daleks is from below, emphasising their menace and stature while avoiding emphasising the inherent silliness of their base look. This isn't a hard and fast rule, of course, but Robinson just never really does this. The Daleks are always shot at best neutrally, and at worst frequently with emphasis on the upper parts of the casing, which is the worst idea, because it makes all the more obvious that they're a bit short and wobbly. The shot in their initial appearance as they advance on the space station defenders should have been gift-wrapped to him, but instead they meander on screen without any emphasis on the shock or seriousness of the situation. They're just kind of shot boringly. On the other hand, Robinson does succeed at atmosphere. He milks a location shoot in London warehouses for all it's worth. It's an absolutely fantastic location, and unbeknownst to the production team, a unique opportunity, as the area was done up not that long later and has now gone full circle back to the hive of activity the Doctor spoke about, albeit in a very different way. As for the studio shoots, he does well as he can in making the space station seem like a decrepit and desperate place as best he can on Doctor Who's budget, and he does actually a good job of portraying the sense of dread and isolation felt by the survivors of the initial attack. Robinson also does a good job of the pacing. The story never slows down or becomes dreary, and the action is about as good as you'd expect to see on Who at this period. So it's a mixed bag. Overall it works for the kind of story it is meant to be, but I think those errors are avoidable and regrettable. As for the rest of the production, well, the production design is decent, and as I made clear, the location scouting excellent. The Daleks themselves are kind of the weak link there, though. The props are clearly worn out and old. The dark grey look that I've never liked looks at its worst here. Dull and dreary, but unflattering to the Dalek form, which sounds a bit like I'm giving him fashion advice, but hopefully you get the idea. And I can see why they splashed out on new props for the next story, because they're badly needed and don't help the feeling that the Daleks are, well, a bit rubbish this time around, but we'll get to that. The soundtrack is good. This era produced so many brilliant soundtracks, and this one by Malcolm Clarke I feel is no exception. It says a lot that its theme for Tegan's departure is now generally regarded as her theme, being a lovely melancholic piece, while the rest of the ranges of the soundtrack ranges from haunting to harsh and strong. It does whatever it needs to, and it does it really well. Finally, the costume designer decides to give Lytton's troopers helmets that look a bit like Dalek domes. This is ridiculous. Anyway, with all that out of the way, the script. Eric Saward is a bit of an enigma for Who fans, a figure who's been somewhat maligned over the years, and I have to say, to me, at least some of this feels unfair. He has many, many flaws as a writer, and is far from blameless for what happened to the show shortly following this season, but the argument that he's always shifting the blame elsewhere seems a bit hollow to me, because he's shifting it onto one person, JNT, and yeah, it was mostly JNT's fault. It's difficult to blame Saward for having to deal with JNT's endless idiot wheezes and ideas, and not always making great stuff out of it. Just to pick one example from the 16 or 17 to present themselves, if he said to JNT, Time Lash is going to be bad unless it gets a lot of work we don't have time to do, and the reply is, tough, make it anyway, then why is it suddenly Eric Saward's fault that the story turned out bad? He did what he was asked to do, and the result was predictable. This is obviously not something I'm going to dwell on here. I hope to do Trial of the Time Lord at some point, potentially for its 40th anniversary next year. But the fact he's made a bit of out of being a bit of a villain, I think is at least partially the result of JNT's participation within fan culture throughout the Wilderness years and the self-promotion that resulted, and it's only in recent years that it's come out that he was... well, he was a lot of things. I think I'll say that much for now. As for Saward, I think he has a refreshing level of honesty and self-reflection as seen in how he has reacted to the story. I have a lot of problems with this, and he'd agree with most of the criticisms, which I can't say I don't find refreshing after certain writers made the same mistakes for 7 years and never once reflected or changed. I will say though that it's the extent of the good stuff I have to say about him, because, well, I can't help but getting the feeling he maybe was a bit of a hack writer. He does fall back on violence and action too easily, and seems unable to pull together really good character work or story depth as well as he should. He brought it all together for Earthshock, sure, but even then there are cracks, and they get torn wide open here. We will start, however, with the good stuff. I'll get out of the way by talking about the Doctor and Tegan, and how this is her last story, and how this departure is executed really well. Classic Who is criticised sometimes for having cheap out-of-nowhere companion departures happen all the time. Some of those criticisms are fair, some are not, and this is in the latter category. Tegan in the end leaves the Doctor here, our first companion departure in a Dalek story since the 60s, and the parallels with those are interesting. In those occasions, the idea is the same. The companion has moved beyond TARDIS travel. I guess except for Katerina, of course, but I'm talking about voluntary departures, not that. Susan found someone to settle down with, Ian and Barbara had of her way home and that override any desire they had to stay. In the same way, Tegan went through this story with a growing pile of bodies around her and realised this was not something she wanted to do anymore. The same kind of idea. It stopped being fun, Doctor, was her line. I think it's brilliantly built up throughout the story to reach the point where she can say that. Saward doesn't rush things, he allows this to be built subtly in the background throughout the whole running time. Tegan watching a situation be made more and more desperate, more people die around her, and the gratuitous violence works here in highlighting how pointless most of it feels. The death of the metal detectorist on the Thames is a brilliantly brutal moment, violence and who done right, showing just how much of a waste this entire situation is, and Tegan horrifyingly realising that it was probably her fault that they were led to this poor man in the first place. The death of Laird, another pointless death, of someone panicking out of her death, and someone Tegan has desperately and ultimately futilely worked with to try to escape this, also adds to this, making her feel both guilty and powerless. And bear in mind, it's not just this story. Her aunt was killed by the Master, she had her head invaded by a parasitic snake creature, she watched Adric die an ultimately pointless death, to name the most obvious examples of how this life, whatever good things have come out of it, has weighed upon her. It's easy to see how this slaughter is the straw that breaks the camel's back in reaching her decision. Meanwhile, the Doctor struts around the action, always with a smile and a quip, but also launching himself into the action, but never, when Tegan is around at least, actually looking back at the pile of bodies building up behind him. We see one of the Doctor's flaws at its single-mindedness, and how the Fifth Doctor in particular can get caught up in a rush like this, and ignore the needs of his companion in such a way. That's what works about the suddenness of the departure. It's a total shock to him. The First Doctor could see what was happening with Susan in the Dalek invasion of Earth and had prepared himself for the moment, even forcing her hand when it came to it. He had not when it came to Ian and Barbara leaving in the chase, and how upset he was became very evident. This is the latter. The Fifth Doctor is more subdued and reserved than the first and remains solemn and calm throughout, but it's clear how hurt he is because he didn't see this coming. Everything was going to be always the same, always, working out alright, because that's the only way he could see it. The regret in his proclamation that he will mend his ways is all too understandable. Peter Davison and Janet Fielding are the real MVPs here. In the departure scene, the grief buried under the surface is brilliantly portrayed by Davison. It would be out of character for the Fifth Doctor to yell and scream about it, but his delivery of the "mend my ways" lines shows that in a way he wants to, but is suppressing it. And Fielding is just terrific throughout. She really shines in the departure scene though. The feeling that she knows that she might regret this, the decision that's tearing her apart, the one she ultimately feels she has to take, it's there in every single word, and it's just brilliant. Fielding is a very underrated performance for the show, in my view. She took a few stories to properly settle in, but once she did, there were always subtleties to it, and especially she shone when she got good material like this. Top quality stuff. As for the other companion, well, there's less to say about Turlough. He spends most of the story wandering around the space station with Mercer, who he admittedly has a wonderful bitchy relationship with. Feels like the two of them just need to go and get it over with and go and fuck it though throughout, but you know what? It's fine. It's not Turlough's story. It doesn't always have to be with every companion. He and Mark Strickson, by extension, do their jobs well, and that's all we needed. Another positive of the story is the character of Lytton. Now, I'll admit a lot of this comes from Maurice Corbin's performance, which is immense gravitas and charisma. You really believe in his performance that he is as tough and intelligent as he's written. I like Lytton as a character a lot, his rather less than impressive use in his second appearance notwithstanding, because he's a character type that's so rarely done right. The tough rogue mercenary type is such an easy character to do badly, because you make them come across so stereotypically rough and hard-edged, to the point where they just come across as either a complete arsehole or a character barely a step out of a Monty Python sketch. Lytton avoids all of this by being shown as extremely competent, smart and resourceful, and also skimming a fine line by being both extremely ruthless, but not completely unlikable either. He stands up to the Dalek constantly, goes eye to eye with the Supreme Dalek and basically tells it it's a moron, and doesn't flinch at all. And what's more, he's constantly right, and they are constantly wrong. And while it doesn't help the portrayal of the Daleks, it does help get across this guy is the real deal. I think the only real issue I have with his role in the story is that he doesn't really interact with the Doctor enough, which is probably the reason they brought him back, but yeah, overall good character, I think. A good positive of the story is its ideas, and all of them as ideas are solid. As I said at the start, there's a lot of them. There's the story of the space station, which is a story about decay and neglect caused by corruption of a faraway officialdom. Of its crew resisting after the Daleks invade, which is an idea for a tense survival story. There's the Daleks defeating the Mavellan War and their status now, a great idea of the look at the consequences of destiny. How the Daleks' weaknesses were exploited and the status of the universe where the Daleks are clearly a weak second-rate power. Something the show's never really looked at. They're either being the dominant destroyers of the universe or pretty much entirely wiped out. This idea of them trying to rebuild is interesting. There's Davros and his relationship with the Daleks, and the divided loyalties that result, and how in the end both of them view the other as a tool, and why that's mutually destructive, and of course how this relates to Davros' relationship with the Doctor. The duplicates of the Daleks' plot, and fascinating potential, and I could go on. There's a lot of great ideas here. The problem, I think you know where this is going, is that most of these just remain as ideas. They don't get enough time to develop or become actual stories, and therefore just remain as plot points and nothing else. Taking those I mentioned, the space station decay stuff gets about 2 conversations between Mercer and Styles before it disappears. The survival of the remaining crew is just a convenient means for characters to meet each other, and everyone acts like it's just an annoying day in the office rather than a desperate fight for survival. The Dalek stuff is merely talked about, the Mavellan virus and MacGuffin in the Davros plot, and their status in the universe goes nowhere and seems to be contradictory in how it's portrayed throughout the story anyway. Davros' stuff, well, we'll talk about that in a bit. Amber duplicates are another convenient story point. Their existence never really given him thematic grounding, and the Dalek plot against Gallifrey goes nowhere. You get the idea, these all stay as ideas, as potential plot points, and it's so frustrating because ideas, they're so good, but as part of the story they go fucking nowhere. Very little doesn't just go nowhere as used as a convenient plot-moving device and nothing else. I'd love to know about how crappy this Earth government is, and how they've let Davros be so easy to get out, or understand the Daleks' place in the universe and how they've been driven to seeking out Davros as their only desperate solution. It would be so interesting to explore, but we don't explore it at all. There are 2 reasons for this. Firstly, Saward is, as I said, unfortunately not someone whose strength is depth and development. Even in his better works, a lot goes unexplored and only works better because of the lack of reason number 2. He probably just seems a bit more interested in the Dalek and troopers fighting each other. But the more important reason is that, well, simply too much. It's too much. He's overpacking far too much into all the available time. This either needs to be expanded to 6 episodes, something they really did in this time, or cut some of the ideas. It's a shame to lose good ideas, of course, but it's better to have a few you can really properly develop and save others for another time, than use them all and have none of them be properly explored. The thing with Earthshock is that it does have some of the same problems of this story, but it's far more a successful piece overall because the amount of ideas is kept much, much lower than this, and it does allow more time to develop the ones that are there. It therefore leaves this story feeling a bit flat and surface level, like, well, there's no greater point to it. For most previous Dalek stories, even the shit ones, I can tell you what the story they were trying to tell, but for this, maybe it's a consequence of how overstuffed it is, but honestly I can't tell you what the main story is here, and I certainly can't tell you what the thematic point is. That I think is honestly its biggest problem. It just feels a bit confused, like it doesn't know what it wants to focus on, and the whole thing doesn't feel like a coherent whole as a result. So, this brings us on to Davros. First of all, Terry Malloy was good casting here. He's not a patch on Michael Wisher, but he certainly brings a unique performance to the role, and the fact he was allowed to make it his own with new makeup, compared to how David Goodison was permanently cast in Wisher's shadow, that was a good move. Malloy I've always felt has done well with a subtler Davros, the skill will show off very well in the next story, but always went a bit too over the top with insane Davros. Nevertheless, I do like his performance, and I see why he's become the Expanded Universe's go-to Davros. As for Davros' story, well, his inclusion makes sense. If he was going to be in Destiny, then it meant he would have to be here too. And while the idea is a bit repetitive of Destiny, the Daleks wanting Davros' help, there are differences in the execution that help distinguish it sufficiently. One in that story was because they wanted to help escape the logic trap. Here they're digging him up out of desperation, because they need to throw anything at the wall to see what sticks, and getting him in as their version of a consultant might as well be given a shot. Davros' machinations and ambitions result, and this obviously affects the relationship. As I said earlier, it shows that in the end they just use each other as a tool, and that is mutually destructive. In theory, it should work. The problem is that, well, to repeat myself, not enough time is given to it, and not enough development is given to what's there. But Daleks and Davros barely even interact. We don't get enough of an idea of their motivation for wanting him, especially as they change their minds so quickly it's kind of absurd. This spend lots of resources to recover Davros plan that they went all to the trouble to ends up lasting for about an hour before they decide to kill him. Equally, his relationship with them is not painted as something there's any real intrigue about, something that tells us anything about him. He just wants to use them for power, and this astonishingly simplistic interpretation of his character from Genesis. For what Saward himself claims is the main plot, it mostly consists of Davros scheming and not in a very interesting way. If it was such an important plot, then surely better plot device could have been found than the turn into my slave injector he just happens to have in his chair that he can use on Dirty Den and a few others. One imagines that he would have found dealing with the Card Revolt in Genesis quite a bit easier if he had this lying around. His bickering with the Daleks, indirectly through Lytton, because why have them interact, that might be interesting, consists mostly of hilariously transparent plot devices. We have to stay on the space station because that's what we've built the set for. He might as well come out and say that, frankly. Overall, it just feels very weak. Davros' motivations aren't set well enough, and his relationship with the Daleks feels lacking. But there is good stuff. The best scene in the story is the one that involves the relationship between the Doctor and Davros, and a sign of why this one is so vital whenever Davros appears. After finding out the Daleks' plans, the Doctor decides he has only one course of action: kill Davros. A good moment that shows he's been pushed into the seriousness of the situation by the threat to Gallifrey, and indeed he brings up Genesis to show that he's perhaps changed from the consequences of the decision there, and intends to make a different one now. It's the best kind of callback, one that rewards those in the know, but also makes sense to casual viewers from just a one-line of dialogue. Anywho, the Doctor makes his way to Davros, who arrogantly presumes the Doctor is there to be his prisoner, until the Doctor takes the gun and points it at him. Suddenly the tables are turned and Davros pleads for his life, with stuff about wanting to make the Daleks more peaceful that such obvious bullshit just makes the Doctor angrier. But then Davros realises the Doctor is hesitating. He can't do it. The tables are turned back, and despite the gun in his face, Davros has the upper hand simply because he realises the Doctor can say he'll kill in the abstract, or indeed kill in self-defence as he's done many times, but to stare an alarmed person in the face, point a gun at their head, and knowingly kill them despite their pleas not to, is a step too far, even if it's Davros, and he revels in it. He calls the Doctor a coward to his face. It's an astonishingly great scene, telling us everything we need to know about these characters just through the actions and interactions. The Doctor is determined and righteous, but also lacks the ability to be as cold-blooded as he needs to be to get this deed done. While Davros is arrogant and petty, in his initial threats to the Doctor, his pathetic attempts to bargain when he fears his life, and his gloating when he realises there's no threat at all. It shows the differences and similarities between them. Davros is more ruthless and cold-blooded, of course, but it shows they have the same flaws. The Doctor too is over-arrogant and too sure of himself until the moment comes when he realises that was a facade. Davros cracks under the threat to his life until he realises it's not there, and the Doctor cracks under the pressure of having to do something he can't stomach. It's not long, and the only real issue with it is the method by which it ends, the Doctor running out to deal with an issue outside and getting locked out is a bit cheap and anticlimactic. With better structure in terms of timing and pacing, it could have been resolved better. But as I said, it's the best scene in the story, and a sign of how the Doctor-Davros relationship elevates otherwise mediocre stories, a theme we'll be seeing coming up more than once in the future. Finally, there's the Daleks themselves. They're a bit crap here. I've said they don't look good, but it's the way they're written as well. They come across as pathetic, easily beaten and not very smart. It takes Lytton to tell them how to defeat a pretty pathetic force of defenders as a space station, and indeed most of their successes in this story come from Lytton rather than themselves. It's also pathetic how easily the one in the warehouse gets defeated. The Eye Stalk just feels like a cheat code at this point, and, well, the Mavellan virus is just another way they can die in ridiculous ways. I mean, when you think of anti-Dalek virus, you think of them exploding into toothpaste, right? And that's being charitable, I think you know what else I could have called it. Not only do they trundle along and look rubbish, they achieve very little and don't seem like a powerful force at all. Now, if this was part of the theme, developing the idea I've mentioned a few times, them being at a low ebb after losing the war, and this being sort of a less powerful Daleks, I'd be more forgiving, but it just doesn't seem like it's part of it at all. It just seems like they're being pathetic on their own, and it's not really being developed as part of that. Now they do have their moments. The one in the warehouse still being a huge danger while outside the casing is a great moment that shows how dangerous the Daleks can be even in their mutant form, but there's too little of that in this story. The Dalek Supreme boasting about how their convoluted plan that makes no sense is going to destroy the Earth, only for said Dalek Supreme to be presumably destroyed in the explosion, but the Doctor saying, oh no, their plan will more or less be defeated on its own, just kinds of how little a threat we have to take the Daleks at the moment. This is unfortunately not something that would be really fixed until New Who came along, when RTD wisely, but sadly temporarily, made them feel like an unstoppable threat again. They certainly don't feel like one here. There's a bunch of stuff I don't even cover here, like Stein and the duplicates, but honestly I have only so many ways to say it's not given enough time or depth, so I won't bother. I'll say this for this story. It's eminently watchable, much more so than Destiny, as it lacks that story's long dreary periods where nothing is happening. It's paced well and always feels like there's something going on. You can never say you'll be bored watching it. And that's the thing, it's not bad at all. I probably sound more negative than I really am because I'm mostly disappointed by the wasted potential. The story could have been much more, so much more with all the great ideas, but they just weren't given what they needed to flourish. Eric Saward is someone with a mixed legacy, but some maligning of him is fair, someone it isn't. But I think it's the same for how the story turns out, shows he was able to reflect, and I think if I was him I'd be disappointed as well. Not because it's terrible or even bad, because it's not, but because it could and should have been a lot more. Final score for this story is therefore 5 out of 10. I'd say it's average for Classic Who. Watchable and entertaining, some good ideas and character beats, a few willing performances. You'd find a lot worse even in some of the stories that surround it, but the killer is just the overstuffed nature of the plots and the lack of depth. Nothing feels weighty or important, it just goes from plot to plot without thought, and is unfortunately what kills the story's potential stone dead. Not bad, but it could have been so much better than not bad.